Good morning. My name is Paulo Sotero. I am the director of the Brazil Institute here at the center, and it's a pleasure to host this discussion, this panel, this morning to discuss sustainability for global biofuels, tools, models, policies, and frameworks. We have a group of experts from Conservation International and the US Department of Energy that have worked on this. As you probably know, if you have come to events here, we have the Brazil Institute, obviously, has featured many discussions on this topic. The Union of Producers of Sugarcane Ethanol is a member of our advisory council. And we have invited UNICA and producers and students of this issue in Brazil many times here. Our opinion is that on the Brazilian case, biofuels is a positive thing. As you probably know, Brazil produces the most efficient form of biofuels in terms of its capacity to reduce carbon. Obviously, there are issues associated with production of ethanol, and those issues have been addressed, and in fact, the way they have been addressed in Brazil is part of a story of improving social standards in Brazil. But the fuel sector is obviously a dynamic sector. One of the issues that is always highlighted here by Brazilian experts, more recently by American experts. If you read this publication, you will have interesting analysis about biofuels in the United States. As you know, the expectation of Brazilian producers, of the Brazilian government, has been that to create a global biofuels, an international biofuels market, and for that you have to have freer markets. You have to have free markets for renewable forms of energy in the same way that you have for fossil fuels. But, as I mentioned, this is a very dynamic sector. The story is also dynamic. If the US Congress were to conclude that it should probably not spend money that the United States does not have to support an industry that, according to experts, no longer needs support in the United States, a funny thing would happen. Brazil would be able to supply exactly 0 gallons of ethanol, sugarcane ethanol, to the United States right now. Brazil is actually buying corn ethanol from the United States due to growing demand in Brazil and problems in the sugarcane crop in the last 2 years. So it's always an evolving picture. But what we are doing today here is to focus on a study that tries to measure sustainability of global biofuels, of biofuels at a global level. There are many forms of biofuels, Brazil and the United States being the 2 largest producers. But there are industries, including oil companies, investing in different forms of production, including of algae and of ethanol from algae and other forms. So I think it's very timely that to host our friends from Conservation International, with whom we have partnered before, and also our colleagues from the Department of Energy. We have here with us one, two, three, four, five people, 5 experts, to discuss this topic on opportunities and risks associated with biofuels production globally, and a specific means to minimize risks and maximize opportunities associated with biofuels feedstock production. Experts from the Department of Energy, and we have 2 of them here with us today, Alison Goss-Eng and Rainey Chang, that will take care of this part. And then we will have our friends from Conservation International, Christine Dragic, Lisa Famolari, and Manuel Oliva, that will present also their analysis of the issue. With that, I would like to pass the floor to, I believe, Alison to go first.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to make some brief introductory comments. So you may remember about this time 4 years ago, the media really blew up around the issue of biofuels and land use change in particular, and it led the research community, and particularly Department of Energy, to look much more closely at the availability of data to support some of the assumptions as well as assertions that were being made in the media regarding the links between bioenergy production and agriculture in general and climate change. And so we had some very forward-thinking administrators and management at that time. In particular, Andy Karsner was our Assistant Secretary of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and he's been a friend of Conservation International, and I believe he's part of the advisory group currently. And he said, DOE really needs to engage in this space and particularly partner with the environmental NGO community on this issue. And that's really the foundation for this project. It was actually a 3-year effort, and you'll hear much more details about it, but it cut across many different aspects, many different countries, both analytical as well as on-the-ground stakeholder partnerships. And in DOE, and in particular the Biomass Program, where I manage our sustainability activities, really points to this project quite a lot as an example of successful partnership. You're also going to hear from Rainey Chang initially about the Biomass Program and our efforts. This project is one of a portfolio that we have with international partners. And particularly Brazil is one of our key areas of partnership. And so with that, I want to turn things over to Rainey.
I'll use this one.
Yeah, you can if you want to. You don't have to stand up if you don't want to.
Yeah, I'm worried about those guys back there, and I want to be able to see everyone. So, as Allison mentioned, I'm Rainey Chang, and I'll be talking about giving an overview of bioenergy. What are we talking about? What are the issues for sustainability domestically and globally? And I'll give you an overview of some of the activities that the Biomass Program in the Department of Energy is supporting. So Paulo mentioned corn ethanol and sugarcane ethanol, but when we talk about bioenergy, it's really a whole suite of feedstocks and a whole range of products. So the feedstocks that are used include crops like sugarcane and corn and oil seeds, but what the Department of Energy is primarily focused on is sort of the next generation group of feedstocks, so agricultural residues and energy crops, forest resources and residues, waste and algae, and using these that have less competition with food, with feed, with, and while ensuring that soil quality can be maintained to be able to produce a range of fuel and energy. And so the fuel includes ethanol, but also fuels that can more directly substitute for fuels that we use currently. And that's really important for a lot of sectors like military and aviation, where you need a high-density energy fuel. And then there are also biopower and bioproducts as well that can be produced from biomass. And so this is sort of the basics of the feedstocks and what energy products we can get out of them, but it's really not such a simple system. And so with bioenergy, you're taking sunlight and carbon dioxide and growing plants or algae to produce biomass, and that's converted into energy. And so, over time, that biomass grows back, and so you can wind up having, having a balance of greenhouse gas emissions. And so, just like any other agricultural or industrial process, this is really connected to a lot of different components in the ecosystem. So, the idea that the sustainability area within DOE is really focused on reducing the risks and maximizing the benefits. So some of the risks that we're concerned about are water quality, water consumption, reducing water consumption, improving soil quality. We're worried about air quality and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, and for things like land use, it's a global issue because decisions that we make in one region can really impact what happens elsewhere. And we want to assess that and minimize that. And there are also social impacts as well on food supplies, ability to produce staple crops and food prices, and job security as well. So these are the issues that we're watching out for. But there are also a lot of potential benefits that really depend on how you manage your bioenergy system. So by using perennial crops, that means you don't have to plant each year, and that can maintain soil quality, improve water quality as well. And there are also options where you can use native plants, and so that can reduce impacts from invasives. And then, and there are also ways to kind of integrate the bioenergy production into the landscape. And so things like ecological corridors for habitats, for wildlife, and to put in buffers around bodies of water. So these are ways that bioenergy can have a very positive impact on ecosystems. So for what we do in the Biomass Program, we're really concerned with sustainability across all stages of bioenergy production. So growing feedstocks, converting it, and the end use. And so the range of activities really covers field studies, analyses, research and development, and deployment of technologies to really assess where we are in terms of the sustainability impacts and try to improve that over time. There are a number of issues that are particularly important for global bioenergy production, and some of those are listed at the top here. They're areas of high biodiversity. The areas of high biodiversity tend to be areas that are, you could have a lot of production of bioenergy. And so what the folks from Conservation International will be talking about is trying to minimize the impact on biodiversity. There's also direct and indirect land use change where the indirect land use change is when you decide to grow bioenergy in one area, and that displaces potentially food crops that need to be, so new land needs to be cleared potentially to grow those food crops. And so we're interested in assessing those issues as well. And of course, developing sustainable markets is important, ensuring water availability for bioenergy production and to reduce impacts on other uses of water. Energy access is important, and also food security as well, as I mentioned. And so the Biomass Program is also engaged in a number of international efforts to provide data and analysis to international sustainability efforts. And also, for example, the IPCC special report on renewable energy that was just approved within the past couple of weeks. And one particular example of the international work is a partnership with Brazil, researchers in the US and in Brazil, to analyze the impacts of land use change and assess the availability of feedstocks that can be produced sustainably. And I also want to point out the bioenergy knowledge discovery framework. So the project that the Conservation International Project really is a great example of the importance of taking multiple pieces of data, integrating that together in a regionally specific spatial way, and to use that to inform decisions about bioenergy. And so this resource is intended to enable the whole community of bioenergy, the whole bioenergy community, to put data together and make these decisions that do impact so many different areas, like the air, water, soil. Where are people living? What is the available infrastructure? And so this is something to check out. You can find us through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and also with the URL. And so this is really a community that we're trying to grow around this resource. So I'm going to give a quick overview of what Chris is going to be talking about. And so it really falls along the range of activities that DOE tends to support. So the first section will be focused on spatial analysis of resources, bioenergy resources, what might the impacts be on other areas. The next section will be on field studies to actually engage with stakeholders, examine what production methods might be more sustainable. And then the final section is they'll be talking about how they're using the results of their scientific studies to engage with policymakers and inform decision makers about bioenergy. And at this point, I'm going to turn the mic over.
Thanks.
And here's the...
Excellent. And if you guys don't mind, I think I'm going to sit down. It feels a little bit less formal, and that's always a good thing. Let me know if you can't hear me, though. So I wanted to start very quickly by just thanking the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting us today. We're thrilled to see such a great audience. I know I've participated in other events here, and it's always a really good crowd and a really lively discussion. Also want to thank the DOE for joining us today, and not the least for 3 years' worth of support for all the work that we'll present. Before I begin, I just wanted to give you a couple caveats. One is that because there's such a diverse set of people here today, we're going to keep our discussion at a fairly general and non-technical level. We do have a lot more technical details behind what we'll present, and if you're interested in those, please feel free to come talk to us afterwards. I should also say that I'm going to present the results of the project section by section. My colleagues Lisa Famolari and Manuel Oliva will talk after each section about the relevance to stakeholders in the US and in developing countries. There were somewhere over 50 people who actually worked on this project, though, so there may be questions that we can't answer or details that we can't get into. If that's the case, we're happy to put you in touch with the relevant experts who did work on those sections of the project. And then finally, I think if there's clarifying questions as we go, please feel free to ask them if you can keep them brief. But we'll have a whole time for discussion afterwards, and I hope we can get into a lot of the deeper questions and dialogue at that point. So very quickly, some background about Conservation International for those who don't know us. CI was founded a little over 20 years ago, originally as a conservation-focused organization. A few years ago, though, we tweaked our mission a little bit to recognize the work that we had been doing in recent years. And now the focus is really on conserving and protecting healthy ecosystems and the services they provide for the well-being of humanity. So everything that we do focuses on that link between ecosystems, biodiversity, climate, water, et cetera, and healthy communities, livelihoods, food security, health, and culture. We have just over 1,000 people, I think, working in offices throughout the world, mostly in tropical countries. Most of our staff are actually nationals of whichever country they happen to be working in. We also work with over 1,000 partners worldwide, and I think that's one thing that's very interesting and unique about the CI model is we decided very early on to not grow the organization, but to grow our network of partners. So today, over a third of our budget is passed to partner organizations worldwide, and that includes local civil society, community organizations, indigenous groups, governments, private sector, a whole range of organizations. CI has and continues to have a focus on science. We have a huge set of scientists sitting at headquarters. We also have a strong focus on science in each of our country offices. It's this underpinning of science which really informs all of the work that we do on policy, on markets, on community engagement, and you'll hear me talk about that time and time again. But from the beginning, we've also had a very strong focus on practical application of the work that we do, and because of that, we have a whole number of partners. These are some of the corporate partners that my department works with, and we look to engage and apply all of the work that we do throughout the private sector, again, as well as with governments and other organizations. So I want to turn now to the Sustainable Biofuel Crops Project. And as Allison said, this was a 3-year project which was funded by a grant from the US Department of Energy. The focus was really on developing some of the knowledge, the models, the science that we felt were necessary to underpin the advancement of a more sustainable global biofuels industry. The work was done in 5 countries around the world, as well as in the US, and we had a large global component that I'll talk about first. And we took the approach of integrating the work that we did on science, on field experience, on policy, and on market development. We felt that there was a huge need for work in all of those areas, and that without really linking them and providing feedback mechanisms among those different elements, we wouldn't be as successful. I'm going to talk about the work today in the order that it's laid out in the project: knowledge generation, field models, policy and markets. But the important thing to remember is that this was all linked and our teams worked very closely together. So, moving towards the spatial analysis work. This is work that we had done on a global scale. We started this work, designed it in 2007, started it 2008. So the global biofuels industry was at a very different stage then. And one thing that we found was there was a huge amount of information missing on where feedstock production could impact environmentally and socially sensitive areas, and where opportunities might exist for producing feedstocks with minimal impacts either on communities or on ecosystems. The first step that we did was to develop suitability models for 9 different feedstocks. And those were, let's see, eucalyptus, 4 different types, jatropha, switchgrass, soy, sugarcane, cassava, and oil palm. And this was looking at both optimal and absolute conditions. What you see here on the screen are the climatic suitability assessments for jatropha and oil palm. And then this is adding in data including soil, daylight, latitude, longitude. One thing that I should point out here is that what we looked at were areas where feedstocks could be produced without irrigation or without soil amendments. So there are areas where feedstocks might be grown with much more intensive practices applied. These are areas where there's natural suitability. That also means that areas, for example, peatlands, might not be included because those would have to be drained for production, so you'll not see those on these maps. We then moved into looking at areas of risk, potential risk from feedstock expansion. One of the things that we wanted to look at was how feedstock expansion might impact food security. This is obviously a topic of huge concern for the industry. And again, this was done at a fairly coarse global scale, but we took suitability for 5 staple food crops in the tropics: rice, maize, soy, cassava, and sorghum. We identified areas that were suitable for 1 or more of these crops, and we then overlaid those areas with areas that were suitable for biofuel feedstocks to come up with potential areas of risk. And you'll see those highlighted from yellow to red in the maps on the right and on the bottom. The map on the bottom here is Mozambique, and what this really points out is areas where more fine-scale regional or local assessments should be done because there is a high risk for impact on food security for stable crop production. I should point out that I'm not going to show all the maps that we have, but we also did this for all the other regions of the world. We also looked at impacts on biodiversity. And these are areas that we're calling, for ease of explication, biodiversity priority areas. What you have included in this map are Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, which are key sites in imminent danger of disappearance, basically sites that a species, an endangered species, depends on entirely for its survival, so the most critical of the critical sites. You also have important bird areas, which are areas of global significance for avian biodiversity, and those are a subset of key biodiversity areas. We did similar analyses to what you see here for global biodiversity hotspots, for high biodiversity wilderness areas, for protected areas, for global lakes and wetlands. And in each case, what we did was develop global maps for these high priority conservation areas and overlay those with areas of suitability for each of the feedstocks. And again, the areas of overlap here are areas of potential risk. In some cases, like protected areas, as long as the management plan doesn't take into account cultivation of these commodities, which they usually don't, you wouldn't want to see expansion at all. In other areas, it might be a case where you have some cleared lands within it that are suitable for production, but you need to be extremely careful on how you manage your biodiversity risk in that area. One thing I think is interesting to look at here is the results of the analysis broken down by region. So you have a case where some crops are very closely associated with biodiversity conservation areas. You have almost 20% of the protected areas in Asia suitable for palm oil. I think over 40% of the key biodiversity areas in Asia. These are obviously areas of risk. On the other hand, while over 50%, nearly 50% of the Alliance for Zero Extinction sites are suitable for oil palm, the flip side is less than 1% of oil palm suitability in the region is an Alliance for Zero Extinction site. So there's obviously huge opportunity to produce oil palm in areas that are not highly critical for biodiversity. And I think that's important to look at as well. We also did work looking at potential impacts on water services. I have a colleague who developed this global model for hydrological importance, and this is the combined model, which looks at areas that are important for providing water to populations, to areas of irrigated agriculture or potentially irrigated agriculture, and to the critical biodiversity areas that we just talked about. And this is the model that was developed for that. We then overlapped that with the suitability for all the key feedstocks. What's interesting here is that there are a number of feedstocks and regions, and apologies if you can't read all of that, but take my word for it, where there's a huge overlap between potential cultivation and areas that are hugely important for the provision of water services. On the other hand, you have a whole number of other crops and regional combinations where there's minimal risk of impact on water provisioning services. Not only did we look at direct impacts, but we wanted to begin to look at secondary impacts as well. And this gets into the questions of indirect land use change and displacement. It's very difficult to do at a global scale with global models, as I think everybody sitting in this room knows. But we wanted to look at where potential risk for displacement of cultivation into forested land is. And obviously that has huge implications for emissions. We also looked at potential for displacement into critical biodiversity areas. And the map shown here happens to be for oil palm. It's looking at areas of high oil palm suitability. And in the blue and green, you'll see areas with relatively low leakage potential. In the red and yellow, you see areas with high leakage potential. So again, it's beginning to attempt to assess where areas are more likely to cause displacement. We didn't want to look at just at risks. NGOs are very good at focusing on the negatives. we wanted to look at potential areas of opportunity as well. Again, with the caveat that this is done at a course global scale. But one of the things that we looked at was where already converted lands are, and within those land sets, where areas are considered degraded or underutilized. And these are obviously areas where local or regional assessments can be focused in to look at which specific sites may be more apt for suitability or for feedstock production. I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a minute at a more fine scale. We found that global data sets in this case were extremely limited, so we actually dove into a whole nother project to begin to get at these questions in depth. The flip side of the risk I talked about for food security is opportunity, and this is an overlap of areas with low staple crop suitability combined with high suitability for, on the top, oil palm, on the bottom, jatropha. So again, these are areas where more fine-scale assessment could and should be focused, but that seem to show opportunities for feedstock production with less impact on globally important staple food crops. And this is the combination of the work that we did looking at biodiversity and ecosystem services. What we basically did here, and this is oil palm, was take the entire range of suitability and eliminate areas that were important for biodiversity protection or ecosystem service production. So what you have left here are really areas of opportunity for feedstock production with low impact on environmental services or biodiversity. I want to pause here to say that what I think is important about this work isn't actually the data sets that we used, the maps that we got. We're very aware that different groups will have better suitability data, may have more accurate local or regional ecosystem service data, food security data. What I think is important here is really the process that we went through to get to this, and the need to look holistically at an entire set of social and environmental risks and also opportunities. And I think that's something that can be done at a regional or local scale by governments, by roundtables, by people looking at project development. It can also be done on a site scale. So it's not the data that we used per se, although that's all in our reports and you're welcome to use them, but the process that was gone through to examine land-based risks and opportunities. I mentioned that we found a huge gap in data in degraded lands when we looked at that area. So, and this is taking a step a little bit away from the work that we did financed by the DOE. This was work that was actually financed by the Packard Foundation, but came out of the need identified under this project. This was called the Responsible Cultivation Areas Project. As we dove into degraded lands, we found that there was no single agreed upon global definition for what a degraded land is, zero. What definitions were out there tended to focus on very specific niches, either soil degradation or previously cleared lands or economically marginal lands. We didn't find anything that took into account a holistic definition of degraded or underutilized. So we worked with a series of partners to come up with a definition of what we ended up calling responsible cultivation areas, to take a step out of the debate on terms, and to develop a methodology to identify areas which should be priorities for feedstock production and production practices which would allow you to cultivate feedstocks while minimizing the risk of displacement. So this project had a focus both on direct negative effects and on indirect land use change. And I think it's the first methodology that at least we've seen that focused on indirect land use change as well as on direct land use change. The methodology was designed to be universally applicable, can be used for any crop, anywhere in the world. There's a whole series of values here. I won't go through them, but again, it looked at direct impacts on ecosystems, the services they provide, as well as on communities, livelihoods, land use rights, and food security. And of course, on ILUC. The RCA methodology is a four-step process. The phase one is a desktop assessment using very coarse scale, easily available data. Once you focus in on a specific region, there's a second desktop assessment using finer scale regional or local data. Once you identify a site, there's then a phase of field visits. We think that it's very difficult to do proper assessments without actually going to the ground when you're talking about a specific site. And the fourth phase is analysis and synthesis of data. This was designed to be quick and cost effective. keeping in mind project developers, companies, land use planners. So the entire methodology, start to finish, once you do it a time or two, is about 3 weeks. We did 2 pilot projects in Brazil to test out this methodology. The first one was a pilot project in the state of Pará in the Amazon. And Pará, for those who don't know, is an area where you have a quickly moving forest frontier. You have an expansion of agricultural lands. You have a huge expansion in oil palm production. And we wanted to focus in on an area where there was this existing industry already, so that even we didn't develop a project, but if we had developed a project, we wouldn't be driving a new industry in. So this was looking at sort of the dynamic oil palm frontier. We ultimately selected 2 sites for field testing after going through the first 2 phases. And when we got to the ground, we found that entirely by coincidence, both of those sites had recently been bought by an oil palm company whose business model focuses on degraded lands. So our assessments of suitability were pretty well confirmed, which was a good thing. We also found that our assessments of environmental risk had been correct, and that once we removed the reserve areas for the properties, and as all of you who work with Brazil know, the forest code requires you set aside certain reserves, there was really minimal biodiversity value, minimal value for water systems in the area, very low carbon stock value. We did a whole series of community interviews as well, and the communities were not using these lands for staple food production, for hunting. There were no land conflicts, land use conflicts associated with the properties. So it ended up being a really successful project. And part of what was most important to me was the oil palm company that we were working with directly to pilot this came to us and said, this methodology is completely appropriate. It's similar to what we already do. We would use this. We see no barriers at all to its adoption. So it's practical. We also did a project in Sao Paulo, and this was a project looking at the potential integration between sugarcane cultivation and cattle production. In Sao Paulo, as I think everybody here knows, sugarcane is expanding rapidly, largely onto pasture lands. The risk, of course, is that cattle production is displaced into other areas, potentially along the forest frontier, potentially increasing risks of deforestation. So we wanted to look at strategies to mitigate the potential displacement through integration of cattle and sugarcane in the same landscape. What we found very early is there were no technical barriers to this, actually. This is something that's been done for decades in the region, much to my surprise. There were a couple different examples of it. There were sugarcane mills that actually had cattle herds and used the bagasse from the sugarcane as feed. There were also other confinements in areas near sugarcane mills where the same residues were used as feed. And there were opportunities to intensify cattle production. In a lot of these places, it's less than 1 cow per hectare, by improving pasture land. So you can increase the number of cattle head per hectare, freeing up land for sugarcane production without expanding the ag footprint. What we did identify was there were a huge number of socioeconomic barriers to this integration. And without getting into details, they're all in the report, and I'm happy to talk about them later. We thought that a really holistic approach would be needed in order to make this a successful strategy. And that goes from training of labor to provision of credit for pasture improvements, to technical expansion, to really just education and outreach, because farmers and ranchers are 2 very different sets of people. There was also a very real recognition that success of a model like this depends in part on external factors that were out of the control of any one business or any farmer in the region. And some of that has to do simply with the cost of beef produced in other regions. Amazon beef is cheap. It has to do with mill ownership structure. As you have mills consolidated by international groups, they're less interested in kind of innovative and different strategies. They don't want cows on their mill land. And it was pointed out, a huge availability in trained labor who are willing to work in some of these operations. Before I move into IBAT, just in sum, the RCA project we really liked, because what it ended up doing was developing a methodology. It's publicly available. The links are in our reports, or you can Google ECOFIS and RCA. It's a methodology that works. It's practical. It can be done by anybody. And it's one of the first things we've done that really allows you to say, yes, you can produce here. you can produce in this way. This is good. And this is now being integrated into the Roundtable on Sustainable Biofuels as a potential indirect land use change module. And there's discussions on integration with, for example, EU policy. So this is not only being done at a project scale, but is now being picked up by policy and standards as well. Finally, before we leave this section, I wanted to talk quickly about one of the tools which was supported under this project. This is the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool. And IBAT is a project supported not only by the DOE, but by a number of other donors as well. It's a partnership of 4 NGOs, CI, BirdLife, IUCN, and the United Nations Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center. What it is a site that provides users with biodiversity data easily. So it's data from the World Database on Protected Areas and the IUCN Red List. And it allows users to zoom in on a specific area, identify biodiversity risk, and dive into some of the background behind endangered species to develop management plans. So it really helps facilitate the mainstreaming of some of the processes we talked about earlier, the assessment of biodiversity risk, the application of RCA methodologies. One thing that we know is that the quality of spatial assessments depends on the quality of the underpinning data. So the other thing that this does is generate revenue to develop more of the biodiversity data and put that into users' hands so that each group doesn't have to do this on their own, doesn't have to replicate this on their own. It's accessible to anybody online. So it's a very useful tool for the development of site management plans and the identification of new projects. I think with that, I'll turn the mic to Manny and then to Lisa to talk about why we care, why some of this is actually important to other people.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Manuel Oliva, and I'm. I think Chris was kind enough to ask me to talk today. Partially, I think, to give her a little bit of break and ability, time to catch her breath, but also to kind of explain the policy, the relevance of this work for policymakers, for businesses, and for other relevant stakeholders, and so essentially, translate all those little red and blue dots that we saw on the maps to what does that mean to policymakers. And I think, as Chris mentioned earlier, the CI believes strongly that good policy is based on good knowledge, on science, on field experience. Developing that helps form policy. And in this particular case, in the area of biofuels and sustainability, it is even more relevant because there is really no existing compliance or existing regulations. We're still trying to, there are some, but I think it's still sort of under development, and that's where we think that there's a critical need for this knowledge. So for policymakers, again, as these regulations, as compliance is developed, then there is this need for good knowledge and an ability and an easy way to access this knowledge. And but it's not, it has to be looked sort of in a broader scope and sort of the economic development opportunities and still developing areas of energy while safeguarding the natural systems, which essentially creates the long-term sustainability of these areas. One example is the US EPA's renewable fuel standard. As they're going into their second phase, the RFS2, that does have limitations on the emissions from the land use for renewable fuels, and therefore does play, this kind of study analysis feeds directly into that kind of thinking. So for policymakers, this knowledge just directly feeds into the regulations that are currently being developed and sought into. But for financiers or for markets, again, this is knowledge is very critical. There is increased requirements for compliance with I guess with social and environmental standards within the banks, within sort of the financial world. and has really formed criteria for lending. For example, the International Finance Corporation has performance standards. The World Bank has an operation policies that do look at the impacts of on environmental and social issues. So again, this is designed to form a broader base of knowledge to feed into that system. So from those two perspectives, I think this kind of knowledge, this development is extremely relevant. And I think I'll turn it over to Lisa to talk a little bit the other side.
Good morning. I'm going to give you a little bit of a field perspective. I am responsible for policy and on South America, and I'm representing some of my colleagues that have worked on this project, and also around CI globally, because we feel the relevance of this is particularly important right now as the world is looking towards low carbon economies and green economies and developing new type of green initiatives globally. So for our programs in South America, which are the ones that I'm most familiar with, this is extraordinarily relevant because it provides a tool, at least the science side, and a basis for which governments can start to make decisions on how to develop and whether to integrate biofuels in some countries and how to better develop biofuels and develop their production lines in the future and where they can do it. It also provides the data that they may need when they go for access to development funding, say from the IDB or the World Bank, where there are safe environmental and social safeguards. So some of the data here in terms of the IBAT and the biodiversity overlays and that level of data will really help the countries or the companies in these countries approach financing initially and approach their planning integrating biodiversity and human well-being into their plans from the very beginning. So for us, it's very useful from that perspective. And I think if you look at the very local level, there's a lot more data that needs to be gathered in region and looking at landscape level scale, so there's more details, as Chris was saying. So this is very coarse global data, and there's not a lot of specifics for each country. So if we can work with the countries to gather specific data on what's viable land for biofuels and start making some decision choices and integrate spatial planning into their land use development plans or national development plans, whatever they call them in their countries, then they have an opportunity to really build upon this type of development and really think about how they can move it forward in an environmentally and socially sustainable manner. So, Chris? Oh,
It all comes back, right? Thank you. Do we need a quick stretch or can we keep going? Okay, everybody stand up really quickly. I hate long sessions. Okay. Round two. We didn't actually just do a whole set of modeling. I think the data generated there is critically important. One thing that we very much feel is that there is an enormous need to test things on the ground and to develop models and examples of what actually works. So I'm going to talk about two of the field studies that we did today, that we did under this project. One was in the Atlantic forest in Brazil, in the northeastern biodiversity corridor, so up in Pernambuco, Alagoas. We talked a little bit earlier about Sao Paulo, which is an area where sugarcane is advancing rapidly. This is a little bit of a different context. This is an area where sugarcane has been produced for 400 and some years. Very consolidated agricultural landscape. What we wanted to do here was look at how conservation measures, how restoration measures, how integration of environmental sustainability can be reintegrated into an existing agricultural landscape. And my colleagues in Brazil did an enormous amount of work in this region, working with state governments, local governments, with sugarcane producer unions, with individual mills, with local academia, and with a couple local NGOs. One of the things that I thought was fascinating that we ended up doing in part under this project was developing a forest restoration course for local stakeholders. And this ended up being a 5-module course that was done with the local university. And the focus was on training people in local governments, in the unions, and in local civil society on how to do forest restoration in sugarcane landscapes and how to establish environmental compliance with the Forest Code and other environmental regulations. It really developed a whole set of capacity on the ground for people who understood the relationship between, for example, riparian forests, water quality and sugarcane production, between forests and carbon stocks in the region, and between forests and biodiversity. And this is an area where actually much of the biodiversity and most of the remaining forest fragments are found on plantation land. So it was absolutely critical to begin to develop an understanding of the importance of those remaining forests and start to restore and connect them. One thing that we also found was that the more the awareness of these issues increased, the more the demand for the associated services increased. So you have an entire industry being built up now in this region around forest restoration, and we've done a lot of work building capacity of local communities to produce seedlings and to plant seedlings in the region. So you have a link now to income generation and livelihoods as well. We did a lot of work trying to understand the role of fragmentation in sugarcane landscapes and the impacts of that on biodiversity. This is actually one of the most biodiversity-rich areas in the world. I think it's very close to there was the highest level of tree biodiversity ever found, 4,000 species in 1 hectare, something like that. So the importance of understanding the biological dynamics in these landscapes was huge, and those are now being built into the restoration plans of a lot of these mills and a lot of the unions. We've also been doing a lot of work educating stakeholders on the creation and management of private reserves in sugarcane landscapes. And this is a legal figure within Brazil that allows you to establish an officially recognized protected area on private land. And again, with the importance of the remaining forests in these areas, that was hugely important. And then we've been engaging a lot of sugarcane producers on climate change issues, on the use of forests for energy resources, and on the potential links to carbon credits. And it's a slow process. It's more traditional and perhaps conservative area, but they're beginning to understand the critical resources that they hold and the links of those to global systems. It's been kind of slow going, but I think what we've really begun to do is change the paradigm of how people in this region think about their lands, think about the relationship between soils, carbon, water, and production. And you're really starting to see the landscape being managed a little bit more holistically and the capacity developed in region to do that. So for me, this was a critical model of how this can be done in existing agricultural landscapes, and that's hugely relevant to a lot of other places in the world. We also wanted to work on the flip side of this, and we did a lot of work in Aceh in Indonesia. Aceh, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a region that suffered from civil war for several decades, then was seriously impacted by the tsunami. And coming out of that, they now have an entire process of really peace building, reconstruction, and development. So you have an area with enormous natural resources, but also with a very pressing need for the creation of rural livelihoods because of the risk of civil conflict again. The government has recognized the importance of environmental conservation. The governor actually used to work at Flora and Fauna International, so he understands it better than anybody. At the same time, there's huge pressing social needs. And one thing that we've been working with the government to do is see how to meet both the economic and development needs of the province while maintaining those resources. We've been doing a lot of work with the provincial government on something called the Green Aceh Development Plan, which is basically a province-wide vision for how to develop sustainably that brings into play not only a whole set of government ministries, secretariats, but also civil society in the region. And then coming out of that, there was a spatial development plan, a zoning plan for the entire province. CI did a lot of work to provide the government with information not only on suitability for oil palm and other cultivation options, but also biomass values, existence of forest stocks, spatial data on that, areas that were important for water provision, and areas that are important for biodiversity. And this has some of the largest remaining populations of orangutan, of Sumatran tiger, of elephants, of rhinos, of white-winged ducks, and peat swamps. There's some large peat swamps in the province as well. We conducted the first ever biodiversity survey around one of those peat swamps in key orangutan habitat area. We completed carbon assessments in some of the areas that are zoned for development around there. And we brought all that information into the provincial planning process. Now, obviously, policy processes are complicated and slow and not in any one person's hands. So what comes out of there is a complicated set of results. But I think the important thing here was bringing to bear scientifically based information on an entire range of different aspects that need to be considered within the policy and development process. We began to see that take hold within the government. There was also a series of capacity building workshops for government officials so they can do this on their own. Coming out of that, we also developed a relationship with 2 of the district level governments, which then take the spatial level planning processes and integrate that at a district level scale. And again, we looked at the areas that had been zoned for oil palm cultivation and helped them take into account different options and the different values of those lands for water, for carbon, for biodiversity. We actually saw one of the districts create a protected area coming out of the results of this project, which was fascinating. But we also helped them analyze how conservation of the peat swamp that's entirely within their district and the forest fragments has an economic value, potentially on future carbon markets, and how it's directly benefiting their communities in terms of services. We also did a lot of work with local stakeholders to help them understand emerging market standards like the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, how those create market opportunities for their production, and how RSPO standards can be integrated both with large concessions and for smallholders in the region. This is, I think, also a really relevant model for a lot of countries around the world where you're seeing very quick expansion of feedstocks and, frankly, of other agricultural production. Again, it's the importance of taking into account holistic, good quality data at the beginning of the planning process and coming out with a set of decisions that take into account those multiple needs and multiple demands and are done in a coherent, transparent, and objective way. Now turn the mic back over to Manny to talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, relevance again. I think it's really clear that the relevance of the field project of the field project is really important for any policy development. I said policymakers, most policymakers I've ever met are really interested. Can this work? How does this work? Where can it be done successfully? Can you show me that this actually does successfully result in what you're modeling? And so that's what the relevance of this is. It really is showing that this can be done, but not only in the small sort of siloed view of just biofuels, but in that broader area of sustainability, environmental and social safeguards, where you can create this larger holistic model. So this is specifically relevant to support a good policy and good policy development. For financiers and investments, they've always been leery of anything that doesn't necessarily, that something that's new and just relying on models. There is a huge need to show demonstrations, and so this, again, is very relevant there, but also in addition is that sort of that buy-in from the local communities and how the social safeguards are playing, because that really does impact the long-term viability of investments. So essentially what you can show here is that you don't have to trade profits for doing something that's sustainable, that you can actually do both, and that is best demonstrated in the field. And that's what I think what our expertise is working with the local communities, the indigenous peoples, the local governments to really implement projects, and I think this particular case is a great example. The other relevance for sort of U.S. Stakeholders I would just wanted to bring up quickly is civil society. The civil society does have an interest in how a lot of these projects, especially when you're talking about land use, does have an impact. You have development organizations or environmental organizations, many other. And one of their key areas is how is the participation process for local communities and stakeholders, because again, that deals with sort of the long-term viability of this kind of work. So, and again, the relevance of really the field models really pushes up the knowledge and makes this a lot easier to develop policy and to develop something that works over the long term.
I think you covered it.
Well, good then. we didn't let things just go with desktop models or with field projects. The other thing I think is utterly critical is developing the frameworks which are necessary to shape the biofuels industry. And when I talk about frameworks, I mean both policy and market frameworks. So we did a lot of work in importer countries, in producer countries, in some countries that are both, to look at the policy frameworks which are shaping biofuel production, biofuel imports, and the impacts that those have on land use and on communities. We've engaged in US and EU policy to provide technical comments based on both our science and on our field experience, drawing on our local field staff, looking specifically at issues related to land use, indirect land use change, and sustainability criteria. We've really made sure to integrate sort of our comments and the feedback provided with concrete examples that we can draw on coming from our own work in these areas. The other aspect of that work is taking these policies as they emerge, or the potential policy options being discussed, and educating our staff and our partners in the field on what is being decided in the US, in the EU, which are major markets for exports, and how that has the potential to implicate land use decisions in their countries. And I think the understanding of the global context here is critically important, especially for policymakers in some of these countries as they start to assess their options. We did a lot of work in Mesoamerica, southern Mexico, Belize, and especially Guatemala, which is a fascinating area for biofuel development and one that I think is especially important to the US under a lot of the different agreements that we have. We did work at a regional scale with CCAD, which is the Central American Commission for the Environment and Development, which brings together the environment ministers of these Central American countries and which has the responsibility for setting global strategies and frameworks. And one thing that we managed to do was incorporate sustainability criteria for biofuels into regional climate change and agricultural and food security policies. I think the importance there was looking not at biofuel-specific legislation, but at the relevance to this to broader legislation. Because in the end, biofuels really is agriculture plus climate change. So building these criteria into their natural policy homes, I think, was most effective in this region. We also did a lot of work at a national scale in Guatemala on similar issues, and it's now included in Guatemala's climate change policy. But we did a lot of work to integrate the perspectives and the voices of local people, local communities in the region into the policy debates at a national and at a regional scale. And this included a huge number of workshops on biofuels, on climate change, on ag, and on land use links throughout Guatemala with community groups, with municipal leaders, and especially with indigenous people. And one thing that CI has done, apart from this project, is create the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Roundtable in Guatemala. And these issues were discussed there. The results of those discussions brought into the national dialogue, and they ended up developing a convention on climate change and biofuels within the Indigenous Peoples Roundtable. So these are voices that quite often don't enter into the debate, and I think being able to bring them in is absolutely critical to developing policies that respond to the needs of all stakeholders. We also did a lot of work in South America, in Ecuador, where biofuels policy is sort of nascent. We had a few challenges in that the policy dialogue stalled at a national scale for a while. But one of the things that we've done a lot of work with is an analysis of the different policy vehicles and frameworks which are relevant to biofuel discussion in the country, and developing kind of a database analyzing all policy vehicles, all stakeholders, all existing projects, programs, and donors, and really scanning out that entire complex so that as dialogues and discussions start moving, we have the base of information already generated. In Suriname, things moved a little bit faster. One of the things we were able to do is co-host the first ever biofuels roundtable discussion in Suriname. And this was a discussion that brought together government, academia, some regional organizations, civil society, and the private sector to begin to discuss these issues in Suriname. And Suriname is an interesting case because the government has proposed a set of projects that include oil palm, sugarcane, and jatropha. And there hadn't been much discussion at all about them. So we were able to get the dialogue going on some of these issues. And coming out of that, we completed a whole study on the environmental, social, and economic impacts of those planned projects and presented that to the government. It was the first time that analysis had been done. So it's beginning to develop, again, the dialogue process and some of the data behind planned projects and bring those into the policy debate. I think that's pretty key. We also have done a lot of work on the market side. CI sits on a number of the key roundtables, including the Roundtable for Sustainable Biofuels, a couple of the big commodity-specific roundtables. We also do a lot of work with individual companies. And I think the markets, biofuels is being driven to a large degree by policy. On the other hand, industry has realized that they have an enormous role in shaping how this is done. And we're seeing increasing uptake of voluntary standards by a lot of the big companies who are buying and producing it, and increasingly a support for small producers to be able to comply with these standards as well. It's questions of market access, it's questions of compliance with local laws and legislation, which are built into the roundtables, and it's really shifting how we're seeing the industry develop. We wanted to be a part of that and be able to make sure that some of our key elements were built into these voluntary standards, again, coming out of a lot of our experience on what can be done, what can't be done, how things can be done, what works on the ground, and make sure that these were practical, could be applied, and that information from these, again, is feeding back into our work on the ground so that producers, local governments know what their market options are tied to these different standards. I think the last bit, and I'm going to steal a point, but that is an emerging issue of work for us in this area is really starting to link voluntary standards and policy. And we're starting discussions with a number of governments on how national and regional policy can be consistent with internationally recognized sustainability standards. And if that consistency is there, how that creates market options for producers and companies on the ground. So I think this is an emerging line of work that's really interesting and is going to be much more productive and powerful in the future.
Well, I think Chris stole one of my points. I'm not sure what else I have to say. Actually, this is a fairly easy sort of to show the relevance. Right now, sort of the way the rules of the game are being established is very critical. And so what we were trying to concentrate on is research. First of all, a two-step approach. One is research. Find out what the developing and existing regulations are, but not only in the U.S., but also that apply to the U.S. or that are impact the U.S., such as other national legislations or international, and then develop a dialogue based on that research between such as workshops and meetings and briefings that really bring all of the key all of the relevant stakeholders together, the policymakers, businesses, civil society, into ensuring that there's a good understanding of how all of these policies are forming, and really sort of shape how the rules are being developed. Because we really need to make sure that the rules are being developed right from the beginning. And from that, and it's sort of together, is we're really talking about, in a lot of cases, a public-private partnership. A lot of this work is going to be a commingled kind of private and public effort. And so there is going to be this need to establish market frameworks and policy that help each other and support each other for this long-term viability. And essentially, but one additional point that I think as we were developing this, as we were looking at this, is one of the things that the US and the EU and other sort of purchasing countries have these sustainability requirements for environmental or social safeguards. And the more that we make sure that these are sort of, that these are known and policies are developed in other countries that with that knowledge, then you sort of ensure that there is this supply, this global supply of biofuels that can meet the growing demand. So I think that's all.
I think I just want to add a little bit in terms of looking at the world and looking at the Americas in specific and thinking about, the Brazils of the world who are way ahead of the game on biofuels, and they understand the issues and they understand the international markets. And then you look at the Surinams and the Guianas, which is the area that I've worked a lot in for the last 20 years, and where they don't necessarily have access to all of the information. So I think based on the results of this project and moving forward, we really have a responsibility to make sure that all of these countries, as they move forward on looking at biofuels and development and green economic development and their land use planning, really understand what they need to have in terms of policy and legislation and regulations. And we also need to think about how to work and integrate best practice industry or bring in partners that if they're going to go in the direction of biofuel development or other types of development, I mean, it cuts across the board of all industry and all sectors, that they really have access to best practices and really good partners, because there's good partners out there that are willing and socially responsible, environmentally responsible, and willing to sit at the table and think about these issues, and there's others that are looking at making money. So there's a lot of increase of capacity at all levels in business, industry, green sector development that I think we can't avoid and shouldn't disregard as something that's simple, and we shouldn't assume that everybody understands all of these issues. So I think from CI's side, we really have a responsibility in the countries where we work and with our partners to make sure that there is an understanding, to make sure that the work that we've started, say, in Suriname with this roundtable on biofuels continues, and that they have the backing of experts like you all here and globally and from the DOE to really be there at the table with them to provide expertise. And I think that's a huge role that everybody can play in making biofuels actually work sustainably.
Thank you. We're almost done, but before I wrapped up, just wanted to give you a little flavor of what we're thinking moving forward. This was a project that I think created an enormous base of knowledge. Based on that, we've identified a huge set of future priorities. We've also recognized that the industry has changed a lot in the last 3 years, and what was critical 3 years ago has to some degree been addressed. On the other hand, we've identified new areas of work, new lines of work, new areas of interest that I think need to be addressed. One of these is really looking at a landscape scale at the real impacts of feedstock cultivation on things like livelihoods, food security, ecosystem services, land use, biodiversity. We've got a whole set of models out there, most of which contradict each other. We have a lot of experience at a site scale looking at these issues, but we haven't found good large-scale information on what's actually happening, and we haven't seen it done using a consistent methodology across landscapes. So that's one of the things that we see as a priority for future research, and we'd very much like to do. The other thing is, in addition to continuing to work on policy and markets, driving really these field examples, developing additional models of how this can be done better, well, in different regions. So these are a number of the places that we work in where there is feedstock expansion. It is occurring. We already know it's having impacts on the landscapes that we care very much about. And we'd like to develop additional projects and are developing additional projects in all of these areas. So we hope to have further information, data, models in the next few years that can also be brought to bear in this dialogue. I think with that, we'll wrap up. I will note that I'm completely out of business cards, so if you want to get a hold of me, this is my email address. And we'll hand the mic back to Paulo.
Yeah, thank you very much. And before we open for questions, I just wanted to ask something because, Chris, you mentioned in the context of São Paulo, you gave an information about the number of cattle heads per hectare, which is the number for Brazil, not for São Paulo. Less than one head of cattle per hectare. That's Brazil. That's not São Paulo. São Paulo is probably the model that Brazil should follow.
I should clarify that was only in some pastures, not all of them.
And the other thing is you talk about the expansion of sugarcane in São Paulo. I'm from there. Sugarcane has occupied old coffee fields, some pastures, but sugarcane cultivation in Brazil takes about 3% of all land in use in Brazil. It's 3%. About 2% of that is used for ethanol. About 1%, a little bit more, is used for sugarcane. This has not changed appreciably in any significant manner. What has changed is productivity, yields, because thanks to research by Embrapa and other private research companies in Brazil, Brazilian farmers are able to get more and more sugarcane out of the same hectare. And as you probably know, sugarcane is something that needs to be, you can use it 5, 6 years, and then you have to substitute that and put some oilseed crop in its place to restore the land. So this is, this is something that is very much part of the knowledge we have here at the Brazil Institute on sugarcane. And I believe that the theory of the Icone from São Paulo that you probably know have been looking for this information, trying to find the linkage between sugarcane cultivation and the dislocation that you mentioned that gets the cattle north. I don't believe that they found that evidence. That evidence is found in soybean more easily than it's found. But I wanted to hear you maybe there is some new information regarding that.
We actually, they were one of the reviewers on the project, so we have their full set of feedback. One thing that, and I hope I was clear to say, is we did not focus on making the link between displacement. We actually have a whole set of maps and models which show the relationship between municipalities where sugarcane is expanding and where cattle displacement is being reduced. We also have a set of maps which show the slaughterhouses and the progression of slaughterhouses in Brazil and the link to cattle heads. We have not explicitly said that there's a link between sugarcane production and the displacement of cattle. I think the maps suggest that there is some relationship at least, but that wasn't the focus of our project. The focus of our project was what are methods that could be used to prohibit displacement from a specific landscape. So that's where we focused the project.
Okay, thank you. And just we will open up for questions, but just to give you an update on something that some of you mentioned, Brazil is in the process of discussing the change in its forest code, which is, I think, I believe it's very uniquely Brazilian as far as emerging nations, developing countries. And the efforts to change the code to make more land available for agriculture was supposed to be, I think we were scheduled to vote on that last week. We did not. The government did not prevail. They will try again tomorrow. Stay tuned, because it's not at all guaranteed that this will go through the reform that will change the percentages that of preservation, of permanent areas of preservation in the Amazon, in the Savannah, in the Atlantic, or in the rest of Brazil. With that, do you have questions? Sir.
Well,
if you could identify yourself.
My name's Clay Ong. I think that the sustainability problem with biofuels, if you look fundamentally, it's the price of crops go up, the price of food goes up. So there's part of sustainability is that people, if you're creating a new demand and making food scarce, that's a sustainability issue. The other part of the sustainability is the same high prices cause land to be converted to crop production, and that's but the land that's being converted, only a very small part of that land conversion is actually to produce a biofuel. But the high prices cause land to be converted, greatly accelerates worldwide the rate of conversion. So that's the sustainability problem. Those two things. So when you talk about sustainable biofuel, like you're going to only buy biofuel from this small part of the land conversion that's used to produce biofuel, you're not addressing the sustainability problem. You haven't created a sustainable biofuel. If you have biofuel that's made from waste material, then you're not creating these higher food crop prices and causing the two problems that I mentioned, the accelerated loss of land. So I think you know, I'm very concerned about using words like sustainable biofuels when in fact it hasn't been invented yet.
Yeah, I think you raised a really good issue. And first of all, I think hopefully I've also been very careful to say more sustainable biofuel. I think one thing that we recognize, and just as a bit of philosophy, the way CI approaches biofuels is how we approach agriculture and mining and oil and gas, is this is something which is happening. And I think the debate on whether or not it should happen is very, very valuable and should be had. We are addressing what is happening right now on the ground. So this is something that's being done, and we are trying to make sure that what is being done already is being done in the best way possible. So that's the approach that we take. I think your point on waste is exactly right, and that's actually, if I didn't go into them today, but we have a whole series of principles on biofuels, and our first one is use of waste products should be the priority. And I think that's clear. Actually, the very first one is energy efficiency is actually the key element, and that should be the first part of anybody's energy strategy. Beyond that, I think what I've actually found is that while there is obviously a link between the use of crops, prices, and food security, it's not quite as clear as I had thought, and we're seeing a lot of evidence coming from certain regions where feedstock expansion also does generate jobs in some places, increases incomes, and allows people greater access to food through greater income security. So it's not quite as clear a relationship as we thought. This is one of the reasons, though, part of what we focused on, and the RCA project did focus on how to generate more from the same amount of land. And I think that's absolutely critical in the land use questions you're talking about, in trying to mitigate some of those impacts of prices on availability of crops. The other thing I think that's important to look at is, we're talking right now about biofuels, it was the focus today. We're applying a lot of these same principles to food agriculture. It's not only a biofuels issue, it's really a land use issue that spans food, it spans forestry, it spans fiber, it's all different uses of land. So while today the discussion was on biofuels, these things need to be looked at in the other industries as well.
Well, I think your data set is very useful in that regard, that it could help countries guide agricultural development, but I just think you need to be very careful about using words like sustainability.
More sustainable.
Francisco Burgos from the Organization of the American States. Thank you so much for your presentation and for this opportunity. We have been assisting the country of Central America and the Caribbean on conducting assessment for evaluating their capability for biofuel production. And when you talk at the last part of your presentation, you mentioned the market and the policy equation. Well, we found, like, for example, in the Dominican Republic, there is a policy in place that is wonderful policy, but the industry is not there. But you have an important ethanol production in Guatemala and El Salvador, and this country don't have any policy in place. So any recommendation on how to accelerate closing the gap between these two important areas, the market and the policy? And the other thing that I wanted to comment was to expand in what Paulo was saying. You know, the Brazil has in place a very unique agroecological legislation that is a model for other countries in the Americas to follow up if they want to start any biofuels or any agro energy business policy in place. Thank you.
Let me add to your question one thing. I believe that I heard, but I don't know. That's why I'm asking. That some countries in Central America could repeat the Brazil model in terms of using biofuels, and especially in this case, sugarcane, ethanol, as a substitute instead of a complement to fossil fuels. Because in the United States, for instance, it is an additive. In Brazil, it has basically, ethanol has replaced gasoline as the main fuel for light vehicles. Is it correct that some countries in Central America could repeat that model, or it is not?
Nothing like challenging questions. Going backwards, in terms of Central America, I haven't looked at that issue specifically. It is being discussed, and a lot of them are heavily reliant on fuel imports, so I know that it's something that's being considered. One thing that we've been concerned about is a lot of the feasibility studies that we've seen for Central America on the potential for biofuel production have looked entirely on agronomic suitability and infrastructure, but haven't looked at potential impacts on natural ecosystems, on displacement of food production, on impacts on livelihoods. So one of the things I would very much like to see is a study looking at that and looking at what we feel is the real potential while avoiding some of the negative impacts. I don't have the answers, and I'm not sure it's been done, but I'd love to see that. The forest code is a really interesting policy, and I think you're right. It's unique, and it's one of the most advanced that we've ever seen, so no debate on that. In terms of linking policy and markets and trying to bring together sort of both the policy frameworks and the market options, I think you're right. I think one thing that we tend to see is that stronger policy frameworks, at least theoretically, attract market development. It's sometimes slow, and it's dependent on a lot of other factors. I'm going to the DR for the first time next week to look at biomass, so I hope to have a much better idea in that case. In Central America, like I said, we're starting to see this built into policy, but not explicitly biofuels policy. So I would look into the ag and the climate change policy, and I actually think it is a natural home there because, as I said, this really is agricultural development. So whether a feedstock is used for biofuels or used for something else, and in many cases it's used for both, I think that that's the framework which is driving some of the production. I suspect in Central America it's also very linked to trade policy. Again, I haven't gotten into that, but we'd be happy to talk to you, and we have a local partner who's doing excellent work there looking at these issues. I'd love to put you in touch with them.
So to touch on the issue of, in the U.S., us having a more additive approach, in Brazil, more of a substitution, I do want to point out that that we believe that the future really is in displacing the actual gasoline in the same way that Brazil is very successful in doing. And so when we look at future fuel scenarios, we are looking at green gasoline and green diesel, things that we don't have to deal with some of the concerns that on the Brazilian side you have regarding pipelines and storage tank feasibility, but actually using our existing infrastructure and developing feedstocks that can be converted to something that looks and behaves just like gasoline and diesel with bioenergy feedstocks. And I think other countries are in that arena as well. So.
Yeah. Dina Marin, reporter with Climate Wire. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the applicability of your model and your new data set as potentially assisting Indonesia to move past some of its hurdles, defining forest for the moratorium questions.
We haven't engaged directly in that. CI does a lot of work in that area. I don't want to speak for my colleagues who are working on it specifically. We are doing a lot of work with forest models. The policy definition of what is considered a forest is a whole separate question, and that's defined by national governments. And I think that's something we've seen vary from country to country. If you look at the FAO data sets, there's a huge range of definitions, and those have implications not only for national policy, for the forest definitions that are used for zoning in Indonesia, but also for issues like RED. So I think it's a hugely important question, and it's one we're doing work on, but because I haven't worked on it and it's not being done under this project, I don't want to mislead you.
Hello, I'm Richard James from National Defense University. My question is whether or not you've considered engaging policymakers at the Department of State, Department of Defense, like Southcom, and using biomass development as a security reinforcement option. That way we can address national security concerns of both energy, stability, and institution building in the region.
Allison?
So we at the Department of Energy energy efficiency and renewable energy work really closely with defense on many different initiatives. Most recently, we have been focused primarily on the production of jet fuel, and have worked with the Air Force as well as with the Navy on producing jet fuels from bioenergy feedstocks. But in terms of the international kind of energy security implications, that's definitely a focus of our entire program alongside the climate change work. But we have pretty substantive and definitely growing partnerships with the Department of Defense around bioenergy production in general.
I was thinking more along like Department of State and the Central American Regional Security Initiative and different things to reinforce Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica, and those areas which are experiencing an influx of criminal and organized crime activity because of a lack of infrastructure, where some of these programs through soft power reinforcement can help encourage relationships and development of those institutions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't work directly with developing countries and energy security concerns, but I can say that today and this week the Global Bioenergy Partnership is meeting in DC, and that is really representing many different governments focusing on bioenergy sustainability, and particularly these food security concerns, which of course are a big security issue as well. So.
Just to add a little bit to that, we as the conservation community, we do talk quite often to USAID and State Department, and they are very interested in how this topic, but probably broader international conservation is key to their to the U.S. foreign policy issues. I mean, you're talking about, for example, international conservation is like a small percent of the U.S. Foreign aid, which is, so you talk about 1% of 1% kind of. But even like people like Senator Graham a few months ago came out, this is an important area to look at fostering governance and democracy and issues like that. So we do talk to the State Department from the NGO community, and they are interested. The Secretary has certainly made statements about her interest in applying a lot of these for the broader U.S. foreign policy. So I think from sort of a broad area, I think they do know of this, and we certainly are pressing them to keep in mind the role of international conservation in a broader context.
Doug Faulkner, consultant. During the last Bush administration, we worked very hard to build a new relationship with Brazil, a new collaboration to expand biofuels production in Central America, the Caribbean, and Africa. So I have a couple of suggestions, not questions. President Obama recently went down to Brazil and reaffirmed that policy. They specifically mentioned Senegal. So you might want to look at some of those countries that we were already starting to look at, and I think your work would be applicable. I remember your last slide didn't list some of those countries that we were working with Brazil in. And also I was going to mention, Allison just noted the GBEP, what we call GBEP, Global Bioenergy Partnership. Brazil and America were also driving policies there. You ought to look at that as a way for leveraging what you're working on.
Yeah, thank you. And I should say GBEP is aware of the work we've done, at least a lot of their members, and we do talk to them. We're not formally members of it, but we've certainly tried to make that link. Senegal is a really interesting case. CI doesn't actually have a program there, which is part of the reason that's not on our screen. But one thing that I think is really interesting, and I'll put it out there for all the Brazilians in the room, we think that Brazil now has a huge role to play as it looks to export its ethanol model and its bioenergy model. BNDES is doing a lot of work with this, both on the technical side and on the financing side. And I think there's a huge role for Brazil to begin to export some of the lessons it's learned in terms of sustainability and the models it's applied. And we'd love to be able to support some of that development, especially into Africa and other parts of Latin America.
Let me add to that, because we just had on the Hill this week, on Capitol Hill, we had a seminar with Embrapa, the Brazilian Agricultural Research Company, the World Bank, and the U.S. State Department on Brazil-U.S. cooperation on food security in Africa, which is Brazil has now agreements or links to 17 African countries. So what you mentioned about Senegal happens in a context where Brazil is working with not only the United States, I believe also with England, with international foundations, providing technical technical knowledge, but the focus of most of those programs is food security, is not fuel security. So it's very interesting that you can incorporate all the dimensions in this cooperation. I think we have questions in there.
Hi, Jenny Mandel, reporter with Greenwire. A question on the, you spoke a lot about sort of EU and US policy frameworks sort of on the importer and on producer country policies, but what about emerging markets as importers or as users of ethanol? So we can speak a little bit, you know, are you doing work with, say, China or India or other, you know, countries that are sort of more in the emerging phase and have the potential, as somebody else was saying, of sort of adopting ethanol or other biofuels as more dominant fuels in the marketplace?
Our field teams are talking to their national governments all the time about that. This policy didn't explicitly include import criteria for a lot of these countries. The ones where we focused in the first phase aren't really importers at this moment in time. They could become so in the future. It's the kind of thing that we very much have on our screen as we're looking at broader policy frameworks in those countries, and our teams are working on. We're not involved in India, so that one's a little bit off the screen. China is obviously a huge case, and they have both, you know, massive domestic production potential, but they're also a critical country for imports in a number of sectors. Where we have seen some really interesting movement in China is on the adoption of some of the voluntary standards, both for biofuels and for feedstock production. And you're seeing a number of Chinese actors begin to sign on to these international voluntary standards and become certified. And I think that shows a real shift in that market as well, and an indication that some of these principles are being picked up within China too. I think China is obviously a critical market. It drives a lot of demand for so many different commodities. So I think that's a huge area of focus for everybody working in the industry.
And Department of Energy has a strong partnership with many different Chinese entities, the China Academy of Science. I work closely with NEA on the research side and building up really their domestic bioenergy production capability. I believe last week or maybe the week before, we announced a multi-million-dollar partnership with India around building their domestic energy production capabilities as well, particularly on the R&D side.
Bob Kozak, Advanced Biofuels USA. I'd first like to congratulate you on this, on the work you're doing. I think it's really good because many of the models that are being touted as showing indirect land use change are totally data poor, and there's some assumptions in there that haven't really been proven, and I'm glad to see your work on there. And I'm not sure if anybody has seen this yet, but Bruce Dale from the Great Lakes Bioenergy Center released a paper on Monday on indirect land use change of biofuels, and using his methodology, he didn't find any. It's a very interesting paper. It's a DOE-funded paper. I encourage everybody to read that. Just a couple of suggestions or questions of going into the future. Something that you touched upon briefly is the use of animal feed from crops. And I think it's something to be really encouraged. There's work going on down at Oak Ridge and on this, that what we found is that about 15% of biomass actually is proteins that can be used for animal feed. And instead of using syngas approaches and other pretreatments that actually wreck those proteins, it would seem that that's something to really be encouraged in your models and in the research. The other thing is, going from that is, I'm not sure if you've looked at this, but in your further analysis, talking about crops that are more, for lack of a better word, dual use, such as sorghum that can be used for food and fuel, and how those effects would play out.
Thank you. Yeah, very good points.
I'm Harry Kopp with the Philippine Sugar Alliance. I just wanted to ask where you got the data that created your global spatial analysis, and whether the data or the analysis sets are available, and if so, how?
I can give you a link which has the full report, which includes all of the data sources. There's a number of them, and I won't even pretend to remember them off the top of my head. They're all globally available data sets or regionally available data sets, and there's the different crop models. Each have one, the land use, the soils, the water, everything is in there. The results are going to be published, hopefully soon. And then we do want to make them publicly available as well, all the different maps, and we've talked about including it in the KDF as soon as it's published.
So we can get your email or your home phone number and get that information?
I can put it up, well, putting it on the screen probably wouldn't work. If you send me an email, I will send you the links, and they have everything in there.
I had a question. My name is Christopher Browser from the National Environmental Education Foundation. If you discussed this and I missed it, I apologize, but I didn't hear a whole lot of talk about habitat fragmentation. And what I mean by that is, I mean, just taking the state of Pará, for example, you know, a degraded piece of land, well, any piece of land has biodiversity value, but it also potentially has value for connecting different types of habitat reserves. And so I'm just wondering how that was incorporated into your analysis.
Yeah, it's a really good point to bring up. I didn't go into all the details. I have an entire presentation on how we actually do this, but that is one of the things that we looked at in terms of ecosystem services provided by a land. And so in the case studies that I gave in the sites, we actually removed from consideration an area which could be restored to restore connectivity between forest fragments. And the recommendation in that report was that that land be left to regenerate as connectivity between corridors. So it is one of the elements within the methodology that should be considered as you're looking at whether or not land should be cultivated.
Okay, great.
Thanks, it is critical.
Thank you.
Here.
Hi, Carolina Lessa with the Brazilian sugarcane industry. First of all, I want to congratulate your whole team for the research that you conducted. I'm actually interested in the pilot project that you mentioned in Sao Paulo between the cattle production and the sugarcane mills. And you do mention all these external factors and how it's difficult to actually find what's the best model. But I was wondering if you went one step ahead in terms of policy recommendations. So I would love to hear.
We did. I'll actually send you that link too if you send me an email. It's what we developed a set of about 12 different recommendations and basically said that this needs to come from both, and it was very context specific. So looking at the Sao Paulo case, and this will be different in different regions, some of what could be done is market incentives provided by either specific supply chains or by roundtables for adoption of this type of model. Some of it needed to be, I think, policy-driven incentives, looking at technological extension, availability of credit, and really a focus on labor education and farmer education on some of the different options available. And I think what we found was it was likely it would be the combination of both market and policy interventions that would be successful in that case. But again, the paper goes into kind of what we thought would be the most effective ways to address some of the gaps that we saw.
Okay, well, I think we don't have other questions. I just wanted to conclude by asking one thing, and more of a suggestion, because, you know, I'm a journalist. I was for 38 years. I did precisely what she's doing here today. And journalism is not a profession, it's a condition. You know, it's like a syndrome. You never get over it. My reaction when I see studies like that, I see a lot of them, in the United States, they are always about what's happening not in the United States, right? I have a suggestion that to make, especially if you want to present this, and I think you should present this in the countries where you are talking about, the regions of the world, that you add what you said initially that you have, that you always looked into US and Europe. Because politically, you can just imagine what happened if you go to Brazil, for instance, and you present this. People will come back to you and say, listen, what is the sustainability of biofuels in Europe and in the United States? And present the same set of, because otherwise you have, your excellent work may encounter an unnecessary problem of credibility because you did not focus on the countries. It is, especially in a world where a lot of those countries that you mentioned, or a lot of those regions, are emerging, are gaining political clout, and are willing to cooperate, as you can see in the case of Brazil. It welcomes international cooperation, but in terms of your presentation, I understand it happening here, but if you are going to present this same excellent work in other countries, I think you should start by talking about sustainability of biofuels in the United States and Europe. Otherwise, it becomes like a conversation about climate change, which is something that you talk about all the time in Washington. Very little is done about it for political reasons that we understand. But I think this work is so well done that in order to, when you go out, in order to share it with people and educate people about this, I think it would be very useful if you add that other dimension. With that, I would like to thank you all for being here. I would like to thank our colleagues from the Department of Energy and from Conservation International for sharing this information with us. We are always interested. We can do more. The door is always open. And we are going to take a little break in next week. I am going to announce something that is not absolutely scheduled yet, but it's very likely that the Brazilian Foreign Minister, Antônio Patriota, former ambassador to Washington, that actually started his first contact with the policy community in Washington, took place in this room 4 years ago. He is coming to Washington, and we are trying to schedule a meeting on the 31st of May. So please check our website, because you'll see the announcement there, hopefully by early next week. Thank you very much.
Yeah.